Today's topic is releasing emotional trauma. Releasing emotional trauma. And this is one of those things that even I could hear it in some of the stories and the reasons that you said you came today, that I think a lot of us carry some form of trauma, some form of emotions, right? Sensitivity within us. How many of you would say that you have some emotions? Good. And how many of you, when I say emotions, the first thought you have is of the negative ones? Interesting, right? And I think that's part of the issue is that we think of emotions and sensitivity and we immediately think of the ones that are overwhelming, the ones that we don't want, the ones we're trying to avoid. But what about all the amazing emotions and feelings and sensations that are also part of life? There's this mental bias that tends to happen, and it's a biological thing, right? In our mind, in our psyche, and also in our physiology, we've evolved to seek out the danger and the threats in our environment so that we can survive by avoiding them. We didn't really evolve to be looking at the butterfly or the rainbow because there was no threat, you know? You walked out of the cave as a caveman, you were like, saber-tooth tiger, run! If you walked out, you saw the butterfly, you're like, yeah. Saber-tooth tiger, right? And so because of that evolution, we end up having this bias in our minds and physiology to react more or associate more or be triggered more by what could possibly be negative in our lives. And so what I'd invite you to as we begin this conversation of emotional traumas is to realize that it's not just the negatives, but it's also the positive emotions. Because trauma also is not intrinsically a negative term. Trauma simply means an impactful moment, something that imprinted on you, right? You could literally have an ecstatic, traumatic moment where you were in a place that was so beautiful and it just hit you so hard and you started to cry. Have you guys ever had that? Maybe looking at a sunset or this beautiful vista, or maybe it was even watching your favorite movie and you're like, whoa. And it's those moments of emotion that even when they might seem like they're the negative ones, like sadness or grief, that it's touching something in you, something beautiful within you. And when we start to realize that every single one of those emotions, regardless of how we define it, is touching something in us and telling us that we're alive, then we can actually start to use that. We can start to move with it. And I may have deceived you guys a little bit by titling this Releasing Emotional Traumas. Because really what I'd like to do is integrate them. Start to learn how to take the energy, the force, the frequency of whatever emotion comes up through us and utilize it in a path of your own desire rather than in a way that's an anchor or a weight to you, a burden. And to do that, we get to shift the mindset. We get to shift how we're thinking about it. But not just how we think, because if we just stay in the mind, then we're kind of like these nullified robots and the mind is making all these calculations and we're just walking around, you know. What we want to do is get it into the body a little bit. And so I invite you guys to feel today, to actually really somatically feel whatever is being spoken about, whatever you get hit with, whether it's a comment that I make or somebody else makes, and to just notice. And with that, I also invite you to know that this is a safe space. I ask that everybody in here keep whatever is shared in here outside of what I might say confidential, so that we have that safety to express. It's one of the key factors, I think, in actually addressing our emotions and especially traumas, is to feel safe. Because without that safety, the nervous system is doing this. It's getting ready for a fight, or it's armored up, it's got blocks and defenses and barriers up. By the way, I'm just going to keep kind of going and seeing what's coming through me. Again, if you guys have any questions or comments, you just raise your hand and we'll bring it in. So we start to look at this idea of emotional traumas and how to release them. And like I said, we're not really looking to release. We're looking to integrate, to find balance, to see how it's a part of us. Because most often the things that we're feeling as emotion, they're a part of us, right? But the mind tries to project them as if it was from something outside of us. Something outside of us may have triggered the emotion, may have triggered the sensation, but the sensation is yours. And the moment that you start to try to block feeling, then you're blocking all the feelings, the good ones and the bad ones. I see this happen all the time. I work with a lot of people one-on-one, and one of the first things they often tell me if they've been working with trauma or something of their past for a long time, is they go, yeah, I just don't feel anything anymore. I'm numb. And it's always interesting to me because they say that they're not feeling anything, but feeling numb is something. It's a beginning point. And it's an active beginning point. And I say that because I think we think numb means that it's just passive, like nothing's happening. But it takes a conscious effort to not feel. I'm going to say that again. It takes a conscious effort to not feel. Now, a lot of times, the reasons of doing that are unconscious, though. Right? It may have been an experience or a situation or a fear that came up in your past or even in your current life. And because of that, you put up a barrier, and that barrier was to protect yourself. You were seeking safety. And again, that's one of those biological components, something that we do to survive. It's natural. It's needed. The problem, though, is that once we put that barrier up, and let's say there was a danger in that moment, and then some time passes and you're no longer in that dangerous situation, as human beings, we don't tend to bring the wall back down. We leave it up. It could be something as simple as maybe when you were a baby and you're in the nursery or whatever room you were in, and a parent or caretaker, they walked out of the room for a moment. And as a baby, when somebody's out of sight, it's like they disappeared. They don't exist anymore. And so as that baby, you're like, oh, I'm going to die, I'm all alone, I'm all alone. And you put a brick into a potential wall you were going to start to build. And then the caretaker came back in, you're like, whew, but you left the brick. And then every time a moment like that happened that you couldn't explain or you couldn't control or that was harmful for you, you put another brick, another brick, another brick. And eventually, after years of doing this in your life, you've got these 12-foot walls of concrete and then like barbed wire fences and a moat and a drawbridge and dragons. I know it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but go on public transport and bump somebody. They'll be like, ah, you're like, ooh, dragon, right? And the thing is, all of those things were barriers, defenses, protections. And then you, the piece of you, the heart that all of you just said you want to connect more to, is way deep inside, disconnected from all of it. Not able to connect in with the outside world or others and support, or to feel supported and seen and witnessed. And then I think that's where we start to feel numb, because where our consciousness is sitting is on the furthest wall out, standing at the turrets, watching for any enemies to make sure nothing comes. And a question for you guys is, because I imagine many of you are on a self-development journey and self-discovery, you're starting to look at yourselves, right? And as you start that journey, have any of you had that little whisper? It's an insidious little whisper that comes up in the mind, and it says, I'm not enough. Anybody had that? Yeah, some of you, right? I think all of us at some point, we get that sense, that feeling of I'm not worthy, I'm not enough. And I'm going to say something really counterintuitive for this community of Bali and Ubud and for a talk like this. It's true. You're not enough. Not because who you are as 100%, if you are 100% showing up authentically as you are with the good and the bad, well, the math is there. 100% you're enough. But the problem is that you've divided yourself up into all those walls and barriers and defenses, and all the roles and all the masks and all the places that you put a piece of yourself, sometimes in people-pleasing, sometimes in hopes, sometimes in fears and avoidances. And all of a sudden, you're sitting at the front of this wall looking back, and there's like 5% sitting back there. And you're like, well, shoot, that's just not going to do. That's not enough. And that's why I say rather than releasing traumas and emotions, what we want to do is reintegrate the walls, the barriers, the protections. We want to check in with a consciousness and a sense of safety. Where can I drop one wall or shield or barrier that's no longer needed? Where can I let it go and reabsorb the energy it's been taking to hold it there? I've always liked the analogy of holding a beach ball down in water. Have you ever tried that? Right? Anything inflatable, you're like, it takes so much effort, and at some point you get exhausted and it slips, and it's like, hits you in the face. Same thing in life. The longer you're trying to hold something down, hold it in instead of let it out, the more energy you're taking, and eventually it exhausts you. You get burnt out. And when that happens, the 2x4 hits. Once you become aware of a trauma or an emotion, or I think a lot of times we become aware of either the feeling or a story about something. And then there's probably a gap, maybe days, months, years, since that thing may have happened, and now you're dealing with it. And the first thing that I'll say is, one, what we want to do is we want to first stop adding wood to the fire, right? And what that means is we are constantly doing a snowball effect. We feel one thing, even how many of you have started to do something and then maybe you broke your new habit and you got upset with yourself like, oh, I did it again. I'm not keeping to my goal or my trajectory, this and that. That's a snowball effect. You're adding more trauma, more negative emotion onto it. And so the first step, stop adding wood to the fire. The easiest way to do that is if we look at animal nature, right? We look at how animals deal with trauma. They immediately get rid of it. They do something like this. If you see like a dog crossing the street and a car honks at it, the dog's going to be like this, right? It'll get shocked. And then actually the first thing it does is it gets to safety. It finishes crossing the street, unless it's here in Bali, then it just looks at you. And it's like, yeah. Normally, though, they go across the street, they get to safety, and then they do this. Right? They shake it off. They let it go. And this is an invitation to you guys. If you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling something, what do? We sit really still. We even sit down, we're like, let me think about this. Why am I feeling this? Let me focus really hard on it. Why would you do that? Move. Get it out, right? If we stub our toe, we're like, oh, we put it inside. We don't express things. And so that's the first invitation, right? Don't add more wood to the fire. When something's coming up, an emotion, an experience, a sensation that's overwhelming, let it out. Right? Doesn't matter where you are. Trust me, people might look at you and be like, oh, what's weird with them? But they're also thinking, God, I wish I could do that. My beautiful wife, she told me when we first started to date, she said, look, I express things. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure, whatever. Then I found out. She really expresses, and it's beautiful. She bumps herself on something, she yells at that thing. That's why I make sure I never bump into her. But it's amazing because by doing that, we don't hold on to it, right? The other aspect, so we stop adding wood to the fire, and then the other aspect is to realize something. There is no distance between the sensation and now. I'm going to explain why that is. There is no distance between the sensation and now. You see, most of us, we're relating to a story about something that happened, a memory, and that memory may have taken place 5 years ago. But the feeling you're having about it right now. See the difference? If you make it about, wow, I've been carrying this for 5 years, for 5 years I've suffered, for 5 years this, now it's an overwhelming thing to deal with. But if you just go, right now, if I completely forget the story that I've associated to it, and I just go, I'm feeling contracted, or I'm feeling scared, or I'm feeling hot or cold, or whatever the sensation might be, and you actually come to the physical sensation. Now you can deal with it much more easily because it's something present. It's not a story of the mind, which is like a cloud. You can't do much with it. But the actual physicality, you can do something. Oh, I'm feeling contracted. Let me actually just consciously open my body a little bit. Take a deep breath and let it out. I'm feeling really stuck. Okay, get up and walk. Right? It's actually so easy when we bring it into the physicality. If we try to deal with the story, which is of the mind, that's very, very difficult. One of the things that I often say to my clients when they come in, because I see a pattern, and it's almost every time. People will come in and they're dealing with some traumas or some history or something, and they'll start to tell me their story. And I normally let it happen for a little while because it gives me some context as to where they're at. But I know the reason they're telling me the story. I don't think they do, but I know what it is because I've seen it so many times. We tell stories, especially our traumatic stories, because we're trying to prove to somebody that we're talking to that we deserve finally now to not have to keep living that way. We deserve now to finally ask for what we want. But we don't think that we deserve it unless we did the work and the suffering, so we tell the story. You just get what I mean? It's what I always tell them. I say, look, you can keep telling me this story. You're going to use up your entire session time. Or, what would you like? What do you want in life? Well, yeah, I'll tell you that, but let me just tell you what happened. No. What do you want? You don't need to prove your worthiness or that you deserve it. You can just ask. You can just express it right now, and let's see. So now we're looping back around to the fear. Right? Fear is another one of those things that is being fueled by story, but not by reality, for the most part. The sensation of fear, feeling contracted, this and that, okay, that's something in the body. Deal with the sensation. But if you immediately associate and go, oh, I'm afraid of something, and then your mind, because it doesn't know what it's afraid of, because fear is always of something that's not really immediately present, normally. If it is something that's immediately present, you're not afraid, you're reactive. You're going to respond to that thing, right? If I put you in the middle of the road and a semi-truck is coming at you, are you going to be like, oh, I'm going to stand there afraid? No, you're going to be like, get out of the road, right? But if I say, think about if you were to trip and accidentally fall in the middle of the road, now you're afraid. So a lot of times our fear is a projection of something we don't want in the future. And the funny thing about that is most times people think fear is of the unknown. But I actually think fear is of the unknown that we think that we know. Because we're projecting something. We say, what if this happens? What if that happens? And most of the time, the what if that we put, just like we were talking about at the beginning of this talk, is a negative instead of a positive. We gave a talk a few weeks back on reigniting the magic of life. And the idea in that is when you're projecting something into the future, instead of doing the unconscious fear-based projection, project a curiosity of what great thing could happen. Because the trick with the mind is a very powerful tool that can guide us but shouldn't direct us, right? And we can give it directions. And when we tell it, hey, I want you to look for something great, then it starts to look for something great. Unconsciously, because of our past and conditioning and any traumas you might be carrying, it's going to keep veering a little bit towards the dangers again. So you have to consistently and consciously discipline yourself to reorient your focus away from fear into curiosity. It's kind of like if somebody comes to you on your birthday and gives you a package, it's all wrapped up, looks nice, little bow on it. Are you afraid? Probably not, right? Unless it's your mortal enemy, then you're like, Most likely you're curious. You get super curious and excited. You don't know what's inside there. You guys didn't know what we were going to talk about today. Like, you had the topic, but you didn't know where we were going to go. And there's a curiosity in that. But when we block that possibility by putting a thought of what we're afraid of, what we're trying to avoid, then that's another barrier. And what you've done is you've just blocked yourself from the possibility of something new, the possibility of something great, as well as, maybe the possibility of something bad. But wouldn't you rather go towards that which is bad with open eyes instead of doing this, like, I don't want to see it, I don't want to see it, right? If it is something that's not going to be so great for you, better to have clarity so that you can respond more quickly. Is there a way to grow, shift, release these things without this process of discomfort? No. And that's a hard truth to really swallow, because the thing is, it's not that discomfort has to be painful. See, there's a difference. And that's why I wanted to make sure we used a different word. Our mind in our fear-based thinking goes, oh, this hurts me. This is painful. This is unbearable. I can't. And I have a saying or a theory that every process, the length of that process is directly associated to the resistance in that process. The time it takes for you to go through a process is going to be totally related to the resistance that you have in it. It's like taking a Band-Aid off, right? If you're just slow, you're like, ooh, ooh, or, okay, quick moment of discomfort, then it's done. But we resist, especially when it's a change that was unexpected or undesired, right? And I would say, especially, and I heard a little bit of what you said earlier, when something such as a relationship ends, or you get fired from a job, or you have to move suddenly, or whatever it is, there's a loss in your life to the plan, right? There's a change in what you had said, this is what's going to happen. The longer you hold on to the original plan, the longer you suffer. I'm going to say that again. The longer you hold on to the original plan, the longer you suffer. Now, that doesn't mean that the goal of the plan has to change, that you have to give up on that. It just means that the plan that you made for that goal may have adjusted. The quicker you allow the adjustment, the quicker you're back on track. When it comes to especially relationships, and I think that closure that I think a lot of us seek when we come out of a relationship, a lot of times we tell ourselves we're looking for closure to maybe it was a abuse of a relationship, or just not something that you wanted, or maybe it was something you really wanted and it's heartbreaking that it's been lost now. We try to calculate and understand and justify and explain to ourselves, but why has this happened? And it's going to be really difficult to do because, like everything in life, it didn't just happen in that moment. It was a compounding effect of certain actions that were adding up. This is a really important concept to get. That most of the traumas that we actually carry around in our lives, outside of maybe some of these acute ones where it's a strong traumatic experience and moment, but most of the time, it's an accumulation of thought patterns, input, influence from our external world, from the environment and other people. And we've been adding it up and adding it up and adding it up until it's too much to bear and it's too much weight. And at that point, it has an imprinting, impactful, traumatic influence, right? Which also might mean then that we have to start to peel one layer at a time to let it go. I remember years ago I was working with it was a friend, it wasn't even a client, and she had kept herself from crying for so many years. She was very strong in her life, very independent. And then finally she just broke, and all these tears were coming and coming, and like 5 days had gone by and she just was still crying, and she said something to me. She asked, actually, she goes, "When does it stop? When have I cried enough?" And I said, "When you have." See, if we get in the head trying to find like an end point, we're now resisting. Just stay in the moment, take layer by layer. And the beauty is that in the same way that those layers built up and compounded, by the way, compounding means that they magnified each other, right? As you take them off, that consistent effort is also compounding. I'll give you a visual for this. Probably none of you have actually really ever done this, but if you've ever had a fridge that had a freezer that was really just like a little box, and then it gets a little iced over, anybody ever had that or played with one of those? And then you have to defrost it. Now, if you're impatient like I've been a few times here in Bali, and you go there and you get a fork and a knife and you're like, and then you have to explain to the landlord later why the fridge is broken. That's the wrong way to do it. This is how often we try to get rid of things that we don't want in our lives. We attack it. And in attacking it, we're making it more unsafe. We're breaking it when it probably wasn't broken in the first place. It just was going through a process that was natural. And so instead, what you do with these freezer boxes is you just leave it open, you unplug it, you take all the food out, and you wait. You're patient. And at the beginning, it just starts doing little drops of water, and kind of the frosty bit that was around the ice that's there comes off, and now you see this solidity. And it's the same in our self-work and in our self-development. As we start to go down through those layers, the first pieces, those are like the sensations at the very top. They're very easy to note, and very easy also to start to move, and then you just hit this hard place, this rock, and you're like, what the? And that's that ice. You continue with the same effort, patiently, curiously, allowing it to express, which is to melt, right? You just let it be. Don't try to attack it. Don't try to change it. Don't force it. Just be with it. And as you do that, that ice, it does a really beautiful thing. It starts to crack. And as it cracks, all of a sudden, a whole chunk goes, and then another chunk, and then another chunk. And so it's not that you have to go layer by layer. Maybe it took 5 years of compounding trauma that got you to the place you are that's going to take another 5 years. No. It might just take a month, 2 months, a year. It doesn't have to take the equal amount, because if you're consistent, you're going to start to have major things start to slough off, right? Maybe you've even noticed this in your own work, just a second, where you're going through things, and at the beginning, maybe you were just reading a book, and you read some self-help book, and it got you thinking about things. And then you came to Bali, and that got you thinking about more things. You saw the people and different examples. And then you came to a heart talk, and you're like, big chunk fell off. And then you went to a kirtan or a breath work, and you walked out, and you're like, oh, I'm a goddess or a god, I'm great now. And then you realize, no, it's just one phase of life. It's going to go up and down. That's how life is. It's a roller coaster, but have fun. Stop resisting. I was sharing this in one of the other talks, that whenever the down is happening, great, lean into it. Because you realize that every down has an up, every up has a down. That's life. When you realize that, when things are starting to feel like they're on a losing pace, or that things are changing, the planet's changing, that's okay. Lean into it. Get really clear about it. And as you do, you gain momentum for the up. But you have to trust that the up is coming. Would I say that the opposite then of resistance, would it be to accept it? That's the start point, right? But we have to define acceptance in a different way. Because I think in spiritual talk, acceptance has gotten very misconstrued, right? People say acceptance for things like, let's say you go to a friend, something terrible's happened, you're like, my dog died, and then I lost this, and then a monkey chased me, and all these things were going on, my day's just been crap, and your friend's like, yeah, you gotta accept it. There's a lesson there for you. You're like, shut up, right? Right? No, we don't like to hear that, because it's saying like, bad things are gonna happen, deal with it. That sucks. No, that's called tolerance. That is not acceptance. That's tolerance. Most of the time when people use the word acceptance, they mean tolerate it, with the hope that it's going to stop at some point. That if you can just endure long enough. And so rather than that, I like to define acceptance as recognize the reality in this moment. Recognize the reality in this moment for what it is. No story, no interpretation, just what is real. Because a lot of times we're not doing that. We're not really checking in to see what's the reality, because we don't want to face the reality. Because maybe it's uncomfortable or has a discomfort to it. But until you do face the reality, you can't do anything about it. We stay in our fantasies and our stories and this hope of endurance that maybe it'll just magically change. But if you don't know where you're starting from, where can it change to? You get that? And so acceptance is to become aware of the reality of this moment. And then I like to use this word, and you used surrender a moment ago. I like to use the word permission. And permission, I define that as allow for change. Surrender is a great word too. I think a lot of times the association, though, is like you're giving up. And people don't like that. It's very hard to get people to understand surrender when we're talking in these kind of terms of how we release the things that we don't want, how we forgive things. Because our ego gets involved. And the ego's like, why should I let that go? I suffered for that. I don't want to let that go. Actually, can I tell you guys a story? I love to tell stories. Yeah? So years ago, when I was growing up in San Diego, California, and I went with a whole bunch of buddies. We went up to Mount Whitney. It's one of the tallest peaks in the continental U.S. And we hiked it for 4 days. We got to the very top, and I was so proud, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And I decided, okay, I'm going to take a little souvenir, and I saw this beautiful quartz crystal. I was like, oh, yeah. And I took it, and I put it in one of my pant pockets. And then we start walking down the mountain, and it's these switchbacks, which means that at every corner, they've collected a lot of things. And so at every corner, I would see something else that was nice. And I was like, oh, that's a nice stone, too. Well, I'll take that one. And then over here, oh, that twig looks like two people dancing. That's amazing. I'm going to take that. Oh, and I kept filling my pockets until halfway down the mountain, I looked like a chipmunk because I had like cargo pants and all the pockets were full. And, you know, I'm a slender guy. I wasn't wearing a belt. My pants were starting to fall. I was wearing flip-flops, 50-pound rucksack. I was walking like this the rest of the mountain down, right? I get all the way down, right? Very strenuous effort to get there, to hold on to all these memories. And I get down there and a park ranger's at the bottom to greet us and congratulate us on the hike. And also to inform us of certain rules that the park and this wonderful natural habitat has. And she says, well, first she was shaking her hands, and she gets to me, and she's like, what do you have in your pockets, sir? And I was proud, because we're proud of what we've suffered to gain, right? What we've gone through to get to where we are. We get proud. The ego gets proud of this. And I was like, oh, it's things I'm going to take home, put some of them on my altar and this and that to remember all the things that we did here and the struggle to get to the top and to come back down. And she's like, that's a wonderful sentiment. But we have a rule here. And that is that what you find in nature stays in nature. What? And so I had to empty my pockets out. I had to let it go. And I can tell you, I resisted. I argued for a good while. Because I didn't want to give permission for my plan, my story, my goal to change. But so often when we stick to these things and we get so stuck and attached to a story about something, the one that we thought was right, we suffer if it's in conflict with the reality of this life. And that's why I say first acceptance, to see the reality and to realize that sometimes it's not going to be in alignment with what's really true for you or what you want even. And that's okay, because then you know where you have to adjust to get into alignment with what you want. But if you're just pretending like you have what you want, but you're really not there, you're suffering on the inside. I see this all the time. People will be out and about, super happy, this and that, and I know they're going home and crying. They're not facing the reality and then beginning to work with it. So we accept the reality of this moment. We give permission. We allow for change. And a few of you use the perfect word for what that means: curiosity. Allowing for change is simply becoming curious of new possibilities. What else can continue to move me in the direction of what I really desire in life? What else can move me towards fulfillment? What else can move me towards contentment and joy? Because we get really focused and attached on certain things and plans, identifications. And I'll bring it back again to relationships. So often our relationships, let's say the relationship to your parents and your family. Right? A lot of times as we're growing up, to no fault of our parents or our caretakers, they didn't say everything that we wanted them to say. And sometimes they said things we didn't want them to say. And other times they said just the right thing. But we focus on the things that we missed, the things that we wanted. And then let's say maybe that was that a parent never said, "I love you." They didn't know how to. Then maybe they expressed it a different way. But they never said, "I love you." And we hold on to that. And then later in life, we're having trouble in relationships. We're always having this issue when it starts to get into that loving space and things like that. And maybe you start talking to people about it. You're like, "Nobody loves me." And they're like, "What are you talking about? We all love you." No, it doesn't matter. You don't count. I need my parent from 5 or 20 years back. I need them to say it. And this is what I mean by we get attached onto a specific thing. And in that attachment and in that lack of surrender, that maybe you can get love from what's in your life now instead of being attached to a past. Because everything that's going on as traumas that we've held on to, and we come back to your question of that gap, right? If it's a story that we say, well, 5 years ago, that person said this thing to me, or didn't say that thing that I wanted them to, and you've been holding on to that, why? Because you can't change that experience, that moment, but you can change what you do with it going forward. That, by the way, is forgiveness. It's simply deciding that you no longer want to carry the weight, the anchor of some experience of your past that maybe you didn't have control over, and you'd like to let it go so that you can go forward with more ease. And that might require you to quiet the ego a little bit, the identity that has become so strongly attached to those things. That's the other reason I think people tell their stories all the time. Because it's all they've known. It's all they know themselves to be. And there's a fear that if they let go of that, then they're nothing. I'll invite you to 2 things. Welcome the blank canvas is one of those things. Be nothing. But be nothing that is a blank slate that you get to paint upon, that you get to create what you want to be. And also realize that if you can get into clarity of what you want in life, then when you let go of something, you're letting go into something. I'm going to say that again. Releasing, surrender, letting go. It's about letting go into, not just letting go. People ask me all the time when we're talking about releasing and letting go of attachments and things like that. But how do you just let it go? Because there's so much fear that if it's the only thing you've ever known and it's the only thing that you think you are, of course you're not going to let it go. That's your entire identity. That's your whole sense of being. But if you've given permission for other possibilities, and that's something I find a lot of people do when they come to Bali, right? They see so many new expressions of life and ways that people are living, and they're like, that's possible? You can just dance and sing and breathe and be happy and make money, and you're, what? I don't have to work this corporate job? Oh my God. Right? But if you've never exposed yourself to new possibilities, you'll think the corporate job was all that was possible. The 9 to 5, that's all you can do. Or that one relationship was the only time you'll ever love. When you realize that there is an infinite possibility of every potential. then you stop getting stuck on the things that have passed and you start looking forward to the things that are coming. And you can begin to cultivate them. But let me loop back around to the topic at hand. We've been talking today about releasing emotional traumas. And we defined at the beginning that maybe it's not releasing, but it's integrating. And the idea of integrating means not integrating the story, but integrating the energy you have been using to hold the story. Do you guys get what I mean by that? It's not about releasing the story, so it's not about forgetting even. It's about bringing back the energy that you've been using to hold on to the story. It takes a lot to stay a victim. It takes a lot to hold on to trauma and depression and negative feelings. It really takes a lot to do that. That's why you feel exhausted. What you may not have realized is you have a choice. Even if it doesn't feel like it, you have a choice to shift that if you change the focus of where you want to cultivate your energy. If you're stuck trying to hold back those feelings, hold that beach ball underwater, you're going to be there just as long as it takes for it to hit you in the face. But if instead you consciously go, and you let it go and move out of the way, get out of your own way, then the energy was taken to do this can now go and start planting new seeds and do things that you actually want. But I realize that requires a really big leap of faith. And that leap of faith is that the traumas of your past, the negative feelings, the fears that you have are not chasing you. They're not chasing you. They're staying with you as long as you pay attention to them. As long as you are holding an attachment to them, as long as you are identified to them, as long as you don't realize that there is more that you can be living. And I invite you again in this safe space that if something's coming up, let it come up. You don't need to be strong anymore. And that's the key, safety. When you allow for the safety of something, then you allow yourself to be seen because those walls begin to come down. And the support that could be possible can show up. How many of you have seen the movie Inside Out? Some of you? I highly recommend. Yeah, good. So you know what I'm talking about. Right? I won't tell you why there's a reference to that because it'll be a spoiler alert. But let's just say that every single emotion, whether you think that it's inconvenient at the time to show it, is very valuable to be expressed. And in expressing it, what you're doing is you're breaking the dam of that barrier and you're letting the waters flow so that all that pressure that's been building up can be let go. And again, I'll say safety is the key for that. And that means sometimes taking a pause, taking a moment, and allowing yourself that container of space to do so. I see people sometimes on their healing journey and they'll be like, yeah, okay, I went to this healer and then that workshop and then this thing and then this breath and I'm meditating 5 hours a day and it's like, ooh. You're not healing, you're just keeping yourself busy. You're distracting yourself. I said that to a client the other day. She was like, what? I'm like, let me explain. Because if you're keeping yourself super busy, there's never a moment that your body and your nervous system can say, okay, wait, they're not putting new input. Now there's actually a moment I can switch from active, reaction and response to integration and healing. But you have to give yourself that space. You have to be willing. And we go back again to maybe that sense of worthiness. I think that's one of the things that stops us from accepting support, from giving ourselves that safety, from looking for that safety. A lot of times people in a repetition of pattern of traumas will seek out what's familiar. And if that familiar was an abuse, if that familiar was some violent moment, if that familiar was harm, if that familiar was not feeling well, they keep looking for it because it's familiar. They know how to endure. And the unknown seems unfathomable. And that's why I say it doesn't have to actually be unknown. What you can do is you can plant a seed of what you desire, of what you really want in life. You might be thinking, okay, yeah, planting a seed, but how do I know that's going to grow into the thing that I want? Easy, it's logical. Look at nature. If you plant an apple seed, what fruit will you get? Apples. It's guaranteed. If the tree grows and fruits, and it was an apple seed, you are going to get apples. When you really, really get that, you'll start to realize that all you have to do is plant the right seeds and stay focused on them. Nurture those seeds. Not the other ones that are going to come up. Because other ones, weeds will come up. They'll be like, but what if it doesn't? What if I'm not enough? What if this and that? Those are weeds. Don't plant those seeds. Acknowledge them, because if you ignore them, they bug you. Right? They're just like back there. Acknowledge them. Be like, hey, I see you, but I'm not going to invest in you. I'm going to say that again. The things that you are avoiding in life, don't ignore them. Acknowledge them, but don't invest in them. Invest in what you want. And again, that sounds really logical, right? Reasonable. But I see people all the time invest in the things they don't want. They will argue with me. Clients will come. They paid good money to come and release these things. And then they'll be like, yeah, but I can't just let it go like that. Like, I've been holding this for 5 years. And so I'm like, okay, you want to hold it for another 5 years? Like, why are you arguing? And I think it's because they've identified so much to it, they haven't seen that there's another possibility, something new that they can become and create and cultivate for themselves. Even if you just realize that everything that you have felt and are today is a culmination of choices and experiences that compounded over time, which means that you can recreate or create new something much better. You just have to dedicate to it. Give yourself that discipline. And realize that it's not chasing you, these other things. Have you guys ever heard of the concept that your unconscious mind doesn't know negatives? Have you heard that before? That the subconscious or the unconscious mind, it doesn't get negative. So every time that you're like, okay, don't think about a pink elephant, right? Immediately you're thinking about a pink elephant. And it's because your unconscious mind, it's about reference points. The unconscious is about reference points. The conscious mind gives direction of what to do with those reference points. And so if you tell your unconscious mind, don't think of a pink elephant, all it hears is the reference point, pink elephant. The conscious mind is saying, don't think of this. You need both. So no matter what you do, if you're always thinking about, focused on, giving your attention and nourishment to that which you are avoiding, you are investing in it. Shift it around. How can you avoid investing in these things that maybe you don't want, these patterns, these influences, these circumstances, if you're just surrounded by them all the time? Move. And I can see even from your expression, when I say move, the mind goes, but then I have to give up this and I have to give up that. Decide what's more valuable. Okay? Decide what's more valuable. How many of you have been in a relationship at some point that you realize you're like, this isn't working? Yeah? And then how long did it take you? 2, 3 years, 4 years before you finally were like, okay, now I'm really out. Because we don't decide. We get stuck going, well, I've invested so much already, or it gives me this thing, and I don't want to let it go. And I know it's hard because we get into this myopic view because we've been so invested that we start to think, but that's all I have. How could I let that go? Trust me, there's so much more. There is so much more possible and available and ready, but you got to make space for it. Yeah? Can I share about your recent surgery? So, do you want to share about it? Or do you want? Yeah. So, Christina recently, at the beginning of this year, had a pretty major surgery. She had an explant surgery. She had breast augmentation for 20 years. Sorry. That you're embarrassed about. Right. And I remember when we first started dating, we were talking about the possibility of this, and she was like, I'm going to the grave with these. What are you talking about? No way. Like, and she doesn't regret ever having them, anything like that. But at some point, it was a requirement that they needed to go. Health requirement, right? She resisted and she resisted and she resisted because in her mind, it was like, there is not a possibility of me feeling confident, me feeling good about myself without these. I've known this for 20 years and no way. And that was because at the time that she had them put in, the mentality, the maturity, the experiences in her life, that is where she was. She had an insecurity. She had all these different things. And they helped her overcome that. Wonderful. How did you feel afterwards?
Great. It's been like almost 6 months. I cried once when I came out of the hospital. Like really like 3. Haven't cried since then. Like I'm not missing them. Like I have small boobies now and I love them. It was the best decision. It was a decision I resisted. I had health issues for 4 years.
Yeah.
4 I was like, no way.
Now, the reason I bring this up is because I said you have to make space. She literally made space physically for something new. But she had to give up something she had known for so long, was so identified to, and so dependent on. She had to let that go. And so there is a moment of risk in every change that we make. And that's where the discomfort comes, by the way. Because we don't like taking risks. We don't like moving into the unknown. But when you create space and hopefully have support and safety around you, which is why I say get out of the space, the environment that's causing that first. Make sure you're in a safe space. And then be willing to make the space in your life, the possibilities for something new. Release what's been holding you. There's a certain, I'll call it expiration date on things. That at some point, the things that are not serving us, they expire. And when they expire, if you're paying close enough attention, which, look, we're humans, most of us don't pay attention. When it expires, that's when you can softly, gently let it go. And move into the next phase of your life or whatever experience you're in. But what most of us do is we hold on to it, hoping that maybe it'll go back to the way it was. Maybe we can extract the things that we really want from it. Maybe we can change it, mold it, develop it in a way that we can tolerate. But if something's expired, it's expired. It's not getting better. Right? Now, I say it as once it's expired. There are a lot of things that haven't reached their expiration that, yes, continue to put your effort. But don't put an effort in to try to change something that you don't like, to avoid what you are uncomfortable with. Put an effort in to create and cultivate what you do want. There's a really key difference in the way I'm saying that. Most of us will find flaws in ourselves, or things that we're judging about ourselves, or judging in a relationship, or judging in a job, or judging in an environment, and we fight to try to change it, thinking, if I can just get that to be correct, then I'll have what I want. I'm inviting you to do it differently. Don't try to change what's often out of your control. Instead, plant the seeds of what you want and make it better toward what you want, not changing what you don't. An example, just a second. An example of that would be, let's say you're in a workplace that's really suppressive and stressful and you're always anxious and this and that. If you go in and you keep trying to just see how well you can shutter it and block out the stresses, or maybe you hope that your boss is going to change, or you hope that the workload is going to change, you're probably going to burn out sooner or later. But if instead what you're really wanting is to feel lighter, you're not wanting to feel so much stress, the next day and the next day and the next day, and for a few months, go into work excited. Dance around in the morning before you go to work. Do something that gets you into a new state of mind, a new emotional state, and then see how that might start to shift your experience of it. Now, if it doesn't change it, you got to leave that job, right? Again, it's being willing, when it's expired, to move on. So how do you let go of control? Even if you mentally really get it, you're like, I know that's the key, if I can just let it go, but your hand just won't let go, right? Take the effort that you're doing this with and start to bring your attention to something else, right? Because as you start to do, you can do this with little babies and children all the time. If, let's say there's a toy and they don't want to let it go, or even, actually a dog's a better example. Dog's got a chew toy, you're trying to take it from it, and it's like, no, I don't want it. And you bring something else and you're like, look at this. Dog's like, oh. Right? We do the same thing with ourselves. Find something with clarity that you want. Start to pay attention to that. Start to give it energy. As you do, your hold on this, which is coming from an unconscious identification, will let go naturally. But if you're trying to do it directly, and you're like, if I could just get myself to let go of this, and every moment of attention is causing you to squeeze tighter. You get what I mean? Bring your attention somewhere else. Now, that doesn't mean distract yourself. Notice what I'm saying here. Do not just distract yourself. That's spiritual bypass. Something's uncomfortable, you can't change it, you're still trying to control it, and you're like, I'm just going to go do this and party and this and that, and then pretend it's not. No. It's still there. Cultivate. Develop something you want. Choose it and start to dedicate to it. Maybe it's that, we'll use a job analogy again. You're in a certain job, you hate it, it's not working, it's stressful, but you can't let it go because you think I need it in order to survive. And it's not. Okay, take a few hours every evening and start cultivating the dream job. Start to learn about it. Start to train in it. Start to do stuff with it. Start to create something. As that builds, at some point it has enough substance. This isn't such a hold. By the way, in a relationship, that doesn't mean go have an affair. Just realize that I'm like, well, that's not going to work out in certain contexts. Right? It means cultivate what you would want in that relationship. Yeah? It might be more love, more safety, more communication. If it's something like a project that you're starting, and you're trying to control every aspect as you go along, know that this thing here, right in front of you, way down the line is, one, going to be insignificant, and two, is going to change course a lot. So instead, focus there, and let this stuff be flexible, right? You're just trying to get somewhere. Don't worry about how you get there. If you do that, then you're focused on, I have to go to this step, and then all of a sudden you look up and like the place you wanted to go was over there, and you missed it. How do we know what we want? How do we get clear about what we want? And it's funny, because when I ask people, what do you want? They'll look at me and they'll be like, I don't know. And I don't believe them. Why are we disappointed if we don't get what we want, but we didn't know what we wanted? You knew what you wanted. You wouldn't be disappointed. So we know what we want. What we may not know is we have permission to have it. Now, I'm going to make it even simpler, and I'll say this and then summarize the talk. The thing that every single one of us wants is always, in my experience, has always been a feeling. We want to feel a certain way. Every single time. Or at least that's something that you might want. How many of you would like to be happy? Anybody not want to be happy? I didn't think so. So we all want happiness. That's something, right? All you have to do then is make your choices based on, will that lead me towards happiness? Will that lead me towards joy? Will that lead me towards a cultivation of contentment within me? Right? And you start to build that. So to summarize what we've been talking about today, we are talking about releasing emotional traumas. And we define that a trauma is something that has impacted your life in a specific way, has had an imprint. It could be positive or negative. And these emotions are these movements of energy and sensation within us. And if we could just let it continue to move instead of holding on to it, bearing it within us and letting it fester until it expires, and then in that expiration, still holding on to it because we don't realize that there are other possibilities, and we won't until we actually take the risk of making space and having a trust and some faith in the possibility that life could be better. Even for you, if your mind has been telling you you're not worthy, but that's only because you've invested so much of your energy into holding these things of control. When if you start to let those go, you reintegrate, you reabsorb, you reclaim the energy it takes to invest into what you want. And that's the invitation for all of you today is keep investing in what you want and acknowledge what you're avoiding, but otherwise don't invest in that. Thank you.